Welcome to Trench Diaries. Gold Beach. Part 2. Just as the Mustang was gone, I saw many flashes of light from the ships on the sea, a huge number of white and red flames all beginning at once. Some of these appeared to be cannon from the warships, with a dense plume of light and smoke. I heard a number of these shells pass over the bunker with a loud roaring sound and explode somewhere in the land behind us. Other weapons were a type of rocket launcher, and these rockets fired one after the other very quickly, veering off left and right from their vessels. In moments, these rockets were impacting our bunker and the structure vibrated as they detonated on the roof or the outside walls. Some of these weapons hit the ground in front of our post, and the explosion sent many fragments of stones and shrapnel against our embrasure, some pieces entering inside and ricocheting off the walls. Our reaction was to duck, which I assume was the exact intention of this opening bombardment, to force us to keep our heads low, to prevent us manning our guns or observing the beach. It was effective in this regard, because the sheer number of these explosions deterred us from standing at full height on the platform. The intensity of the bombardment was agonizing for me. Every second there was another explosion, then another, and every one made the bunker vibrate and sent debris in through the aperture. The smell of cordite was very strong in the air. I put my hands over my ears and crouched on the platform, and I found the two gunners doing the same. One of them had the presence of mind to lower the MG on its mount, so that it was below the embrasure and not exposed to the shrapnel. I thought that this bombardment would be over soon, but I found that it continued on and on. It became impossible to react, or even to think clearly, because there was no pause between the explosions. They continued in fractions of a second all the time. Frankly, I began to lose track of time and my only thought was that I wanted this shelling to stop. I was not afraid to fight, but to be subjected to these colossal, ceaseless explosions was not the same as fighting. The man who was the gun loader reacted even worse than me, and he began to scream and bang his hands on the concrete wall. I could not hear his voice, but I could see his mouth and fists moving. The steel door in our room opened and one of the artillery officers stumbled in. As he entered, a rocket or shell exploded exactly against the aperture of our position and a large amount of debris came in through the slit. This contained stones, shrapnel, and clods of earth. The mass whirled around inside the room, bouncing off the walls. I saw several fragments hit the officer and strike him in the face, going through one eye and also breaking his teeth. He flew back against the wall and slumped down. Outside in the corridor of the bunker, I could see other troops crouched against the walls, in the same position as me, enduring this bombardment. The explosion stopped very suddenly and the noise echoed around in our concrete space for a long time. I recall that I laughed in a crazy way, because I felt that the fighting was over. Then of course, I realized that it had not yet begun and I got to my feet. In the corridor, the other men were doing likewise. The wounded officer lay on the floor and we had no time to give him assistance. I raised my head over the edge of the aperture and I saw a sight that made me almost lose hope. The ground in front of the bunker was on fire and full of huge craters that went all the way down to the beach. There on the beach, a large number of troops were already coming ashore, jumping out of flat-bottomed barges that came up to the shallows. Those craft were lowering their ramps and many men were jumping and running out. A lot of these craft had struck the obstacles and were sinking or burning, and men were jumping from these craft into the water, some of them on fire. To my right, I heard the boom-crack sound of our 88mm guns beginning to fire onto the beach. The gunners had practiced so often, they were finding targets despite the suppression effect of the bombardment. I saw a red tracer from our 88mm streak out repeatedly to the beach zone. The shells struck landing craft as they were lowering their ramps, in one case blowing off the steel ramp door and throwing men over the sides into the sea. That craft began to sink from the nose down and our tracer moved on to other vessels approaching. The two MG gunners raised their weapon on its steel mount, both of them trembling and gasping just as I was. The gunner had great composure however, and he calmed himself and readied the gun and began to aim at men on the beach. The loader was not capable of doing anything else and he went back to crouching and clutching his head in his hands. Because of this, I took over the function of loader and I moved beside the gunner, feeding the ammunition belts as he aimed the MG-34. He said to me that these were English troops, judging from their helmets and uniforms, which were a dull brown color. Then he opened fire. We were firing to our right, with a clear view along the beach line. There were many men scrambling onto the sand and a lot of smoke and explosions still happening. There was tracer fire coming from the other end of the beach and knocking these men down. That gunner over there was very precise. He put a short burst into groups of men as they exited the landing craft, sending them tumbling down the ramps, and then moved to the next one. My gunner began to do likewise and fired on the nearest craft, which was lowering its ramp. There was a line of men in the bow, and as they came out onto the ramp they ran straight into our tracer. One after the other, they fell over the edge of the steel plate into the sea. I think we hit 6 or 7 men in 2 seconds. This was my first time in action. I did not feel anything at this point, at least I was not aware of any emotions in all the chaos. I knew that we had to stop these troops getting onto our territory, and we had the weapons to do this. The only thing I distinctly remember was a sense of pride in the skill of my MG gunner, who used his gun very effectively. He was able to pin men down on the beach, forcing them to hide behind beached craft or the vehicles which were coming off the ramps, stopping them forming up and moving. In some cases, these isolated men were then hit by our 88mm fire, and the sand was thrown up a great distance into the air where the shell struck, along with many pieces of men and machinery. I remember that one landing craft was hit by an 88mm shell as it approached the shore at speed. For some reason it then could not stop, and it crashed onto the sand while burning from the rear. Its hull struck a group of men wading ashore and crushed them completely. I felt sick at that sight for the first time, but I continued to feed the ammunition belts to the gun. The vessels further out at sea began to fire on us again, and more of the naval shells came down on us. I saw one of these rounds hit the ground in front of our bunker and bounce off without exploding, tumbling end over end up over our roof. But other shells hit our bunker precisely, and I believe one of them hit our 88mm positions, because those guns ceased firing after some time. I heard shouting and yelling from inside the bunker and men calling for firefighting equipment. There was nothing I could have done about that, so I remained at my post feeding the belts to the MG-34. I have looked back many times and thought about if there ever was a moment when the Allied troops might have been driven back into the sea. But I think that in our case this was not a possibility, because of the scale of their numbers. If we had 8 or 10 88mm guns instead of 2, or even heavier guns, then perhaps the assault could have been broken up on the beach and held there. But with our 88mm guns disabled, the landing craft were able to surge up and unload, with only the MG fire to oppose them for some time. The craft were unloading tanks at this point, and these were Churchill types. We had been trained to identify Allied planes and tank types, but these Churchills had very short and wide guns that I had not seen in our training pictures. 3 of these Churchills surged down onto the sand and began to move along up the incline to the sea wall. One of them hit an anti-tank mine and its track was blown off. That tank drove around in circles hopelessly, spraying sand. When it came to a halt, one of our 88mm guns opened fire again and hit it through the side with an armor-piercing shell. That caused a huge explosion in the tank. The top of the hull split open and burning fuel poured out from the engine decks. I saw a crewman try to escape from a hatch, but he was on fire and he became wedged in the hatch opening. He was burned alive down there with his tank. The other 2 Churchills were also hit. One was knocked over on its side when it ran over the edge of a sand dune. The other was hit repeatedly on the turret, but it progressed to the sea wall and fired its gun repeatedly at the concrete. It caused huge explosions there, and the sea wall disintegrated and collapsed, forming a mound of rubble. This was presumably what the British wanted, because their men began to rush up this pile of debris and emerge onto the civilian esplanade that ran along the rear of the beach. This meant that they were now on the point of entering the town itself. My gunner hit many of these men as they came up the debris onto the street. Several were knocked over backwards and fell onto their comrades below. Others just lay there on the cobblestones. I saw some of the men who came up lose their nerve and back down again, and I am sure that I would have done the same, faced with this MG fire which was moving up and down the esplanade wherever they appeared. I saw a large explosion among the rocks at the other end of the beach, and the German MG fire from there ceased abruptly. I think they used a bazooka or a mortar on that position. Now our bunker was firing alone, with our MG and the single 88mm operating from our embrasures. Our MG-34 was running very hot by then. The breech was glowing red hot and it was difficult to lift the top cover to insert the fresh belts of ammunition. The British began to fire on the bunker with rounds from their Churchills, but this was very inaccurate, with the shells landing haphazardly around us. But the explosions were enormous. In the event, we were blinded by smoke and dust from this shelling and we decided to cease firing, to conserve our ammunition and let the gun cool until the smoke cleared. We also needed more MG ammunition from the ammunition pit. I went out into the corridor, having to step over the unconscious body of the wounded officer. His teeth were scattered across the floor. As I exited, another officer out there pointed his pistol at me and ordered me to tell him where I was going. I told him I was on my way to get more ammunition. He sent me back inside and ordered ammunition to be brought to our position by one of the medics. I heard shots inside the bunker itself and I guess this was the officers firing warning shots because men were leaving their posts, so I was determined not to do that. The smoke was clearing and we could see again down onto the beach and esplanade, so immediately the MG gunner began firing. I must say that he killed many British soldiers in the next few seconds. A large group of them was moving in single file down the esplanade towards us, possibly believing that our guns were knocked out. Our bullets passed right through the leading men and hit the men behind. Then as they fell, the men behind were hit and so on. In moments, they all threw themselves behind a low wall beside the street, but the pathway was full of dead troops whose bodies were smoking from the impacts. I still felt nothing at this point and was numb. But at the same time, let us remind ourselves, we the Germans were not attacking England. We were not invading America. It was the Allies attacking France and we were there to defend the country against their assault. But I also began to doubt if our position would hold. For one thing, we were being bombarded again, with accurate artillery being fired from offshore. These shells were causing the roof of our bunker, which was very thick, to flex and send fragments down onto us. Also, the British sent a tank up over the debris on the sea wall and it advanced along the esplanade towards us. This was a Sherman tank, a very tall target, and our 88mm hit it immediately on its front plate. However, the shell was high explosive, not armor piercing, and it blew away various brackets and hooks on the front of the hull, but the tank continued to advance toward us. I could see their infantry forming behind it, using it as cover. And although my gunner fired down the sides of the tank hull, he could not hit the men behind it. Our ammunition belt was spent and because of the heating of the breech, the new belt did not insert properly at first. Also my hands were shaking and I had dirt in my eyes, so it was difficult to work on the MG. The gunner said, "Come on and be quick boy, because those troops will kill us for sure after what we've done. There's no point surrendering, don't you see?" That was a shock to me. That my actions could cause other men to take revenge on me even if I offered to surrender. Meanwhile, the Sherman was firing on the 88mm embrasure as it advanced, firing very rapidly with high explosive shells and I could see the shells detonating along the bunker wall where the 88mm was positioned. That 88 got off another round, which hit the tank on the right track, blowing it loose. The Sherman skidded to one side, so that its hull flank was exposed and the 88 fired again with armor piercing. This went into the hull above the tracks near the engine, and that tank began to burn almost immediately. A tall column of flame spurted up from the rear deck, and many pieces of machinery came flying out of the engine grills. In just a few seconds, this tank was surrounded by a pool of burning fuel, literally a circle of fire. The hatches opened and 2 crewmen climbed out. My gunner shot them at once and they fell off the tank into the gasoline flames. I found this to be totally unnecessary, but I think he was desperate to keep the English away from our position. Our 88mm shot the Sherman again. This hit tore a large piece of armor off the turret, sending it flying off down the beach, rolling across the sand a long way. In the remains of the turret near us, I could actually see a crewman inside, apparently immobile, as the flames in there grew bigger. I began to understand what the gunner meant when he said these English would kill us for sure now.